serving a second term. The Electoral College also makes it more likely that there'll be disputes over election returns when, for example, a state's entire slate of electoral votes depends on a few hundred or a few thousand popular votes. Given that all but 2 states have winner-take-all provisions, not a proportional alignment of electoral votes. So you could win by 100 popular votes and get all the electoral votes. They would not be divided up according to proportion of popular votes. Fortunately, most of the individuals who have served as President of the United States have largely observed the norms of behavior expected for someone in this highest office. In addition, most presidents have generally respected the boundaries of executive power. Furthermore, many presidents have used their influence and authority to bring about laudatory results. It was because of presidential initiative from Abraham Lincoln that 4 million enslaved Americans received their freedom, though many of Lincoln's orders and decisions would have been considered outrageous or illegal during normal times. He invokes the Insurrection Act and he declares martial law throughout various parts of the North. So you can argue that sometimes a president should go beyond what he's allowed to do for the public good. But bad presidents could also use these same instruments dubiously. A century later, it was largely through the force of presidential leadership under Lyndon Johnson that millions achieved equal rights in many areas of American life. And through the presidential leadership of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1940s, the American people, in collaboration with their allies, liberated the world from fascist tyranny. And through the leadership of some recent presidents, the nation is attempting to promote conservation and preservation of the natural environment. Other presidents, however, turned their backs on those recently freed from bondage, Andrew Johnson, for example, or sent peaceful Native Americans to their deaths, I've already mentioned Andrew Jackson, or promoted racist immigration policies, such as Donald Trump, or defied Supreme Court orders, such as Andrew Jackson, or started needless wars that led to the deaths of millions. That would include James K. Polk, William McKinley, Lyndon Johnson, and George W. Bush, or created dangerous cults of personality, Donald Trump, as well as some lesser examples. Given these conflicting examples, one might indeed compare presidential power to a double-edged sword with the capacity to do both good and ill. That is, a presidency for better or worse. The American presidential system would seem to be at a crossroads as we approach the 2024 presidential election, given that one of the 2 major candidates has indeed created a dangerous cult of personality, and during a previous term utterly rejected expectations of Hamiltonian virtue and of the founders' expectations of normative behavior. Since 2 impeachments failed to curb his early abuses of power, since he was not convicted in the Senate, there's little reason to expect impeachment to operate as a check against any abuses of power in a second Trump term, nor is it likely that a Supreme Court, which this former president has packed with fervent supporters, will act to check him. Even if the High Court did act to check him, it would lack the ability to enforce any such decisions, since, as I've said, presidents are, after all, the chief executors of the United States. In any case, because of the recent Supreme Court case of Donald Trump versus the United States, the High Court has declared that presidents are immune from legal prosecution for anything they do as president. Now, whatever I've said during this talk, I didn't mean to demean or dishonor the Constitution, since it's the bedrock of our liberty and democracy, given various amendments to the document, coupled with acts of Congress over the past centuries that have advanced our liberty and democracy. But the Constitution needs to be amended to abolish the Electoral College and end the life appointments of Supreme Court justices. And I would add, when the convention decided that they would serve for life, average life expectancy was 35 years. Now it's about 80 in most advanced countries, more than twice that. And in the early years, the average tenure of a Supreme Court justice was 8.5 years, not 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and so forth, so that they would be completely out of touch with the president who appointed them or the issues that are existing in the present day. In addition, several Supreme Court rulings need to be overturned, among them Trump versus the United States, which I've just mentioned. Citizens United, a 2010 case which allows unlimited campaign contributions, and Shelby County versus Holder, a 2013 decision, which limited the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So much needs to be done, Jeffrey.
Thank you, David. I have very similar points of concern to make relevant to democracy and the Constitution. I think we'll have a meeting of the minds and seem to flesh this out, and maybe we can tie up to the role of the presidential election into it, to thinking about this, and to maybe even possibly prohibiting or advancing some of these things that we think about. As I was preparing for this, I needed to revisit my original notes if I could find them. I found them about the 2016 Real Talk. And how we started that talk was providing the foundation that you'll see up here, that we contextualize this environment that we're in this broader context of what's called political polarization, meaning that our attitudes, not just between the political parties, but among the American public at large, have really started to be disparate and distinct into these two camps as far back as into 1994. We unpacked that somewhat, and then started to think about many of which the norms that were broken in the 2016 election. I think that was a call that we had here at the college, thinking about that, certainly a demand of wanting to talk about that in a forum. And we had some interesting quotes from that forum. I just pulled a couple before I get to my points about the current times. The days of the slick talking politician, is it over? In ways that we have never seen, the electorate wants someone who engages in real talk. Can his candidate tell it like it is? It's been clear that America wants a candidate that is a straight shooter, that gets right to the point and gives answers, no fluff. Another, we wade through the sea of information which contains very irresponsible bias on behalf of the media, seem to care somewhat if the information was obtained illegally. And we have no gauge on the degree of misinformation that is out there in the cybersphere. Make me think, how far away are we from the truth? Others are thinking the same in this information age. Do you blame us for being doubtful, skeptical, cynical right now? We concluded with this. In this political and information environment, it creates the perfect conditions for scandal. Okay. But there's a silver lining. The American public is paying attention to the election in a different way. Civic engagement's up. We can't escape it, but at what cost? Have we hit rock bottom, or is this just the beginning? And I suppose in a way, David, this is a question that we've been chasing for 8 years. And little did we know about what was going to last after that and what we've experienced. And what we both agree on is in some erosion of democratic standards and norms. So exactly what are they? In order to have a stable system that allows everyday people to participate in government and public affairs, we have to have some bare bones with free and fair elections, separation of powers, freedom of expression in the press, respect for human rights and freedoms, and this idea of pluralism of institutions, concept that contends that diversity is beneficial, it's not a hindrance to society. Now, the data shows that there's been this precipitous drop through the 21st century, starting in the George W. Bush administration and running through the Obama presidency. It plummets in the Trump administration, carries through the Biden administration. So in turn with that, we've really been responding to the idea about public trust in government is in its erosion, and we're living through that point here. I'm showing you here how this is from all the way back to 1960. I think that, David, that you argue that a lot of this had started in the Nixon administration with Watergate, and it's been falling with ebbs and flows since, with the exception of some points through the Reagan administration, 9/11. The Freedom of the World report published by Freedom House, it publishes every year how countries are faring across the world for democratic standards, and generally groups these countries into these three categories: free, partly free, and not free. It finds that overall across the world, in the global context, the freedom has, and democratic norms with that have declined for 18 consecutive years. So it kind of correlates to this lack of trust in government. And interestingly, in 195 countries, there are these 83 free countries, 56 that are partly free, 56 not free. But interestingly, you put the United States into context, and in the rankings, it's free, but it falls well behind other free nations like Canada, almost all of Western Europe, Australia, and on par today with other countries such as Argentina and Romania, Lithuania, South Africa, Latvia. And in 2017 and 2018 just really marked this pivot point, just in terms of political rights and civil liberties, just given that their report was all kinds of things that were happening to election interference, a lack of ethical standards, reduction of transparency, verbal attacks on the press, and so forth. So far so that the United Nations stated that the United States is undergoing these really major challenges in terms of peace, justice, and strong institutions. One of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're far from meeting the goal of promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building these effective and accountable, inclusive institutions to boot. The United States, supposedly, it's long been thought of as arbiter of freedom, democracy, etc. So we're sliding into this democratic erosion. It's really questioning our core foundation. And it's here that I want to echo David's point, just related to the Constitution. And really the debate among the last couple of years is that the idea of constitutional crisis. So what happens when the spirit of the Constitution fails at its purpose, and there are things and behavior out of it that are really just, the document itself are just stretched outside the confines of its own law. What do we do? Just a couple more points here. Just a word on policy. It's just really interesting because some of the conversation has really been about the things that we should be thinking about and can favor in terms of institutional reform. There are so many things, interestingly, among the American public. We're in favor of term limits for Congress, a maximum age limit for elected officials, or even auto registration for voting. We're not in favor of increasing the justices of the Supreme Court, and also wanting some kind of electoral college reform. The ideas and the technical solutions to reforming democracy, they're all there. They're on the table. They're discussed among various communities very vigorously, and they have support. But unfortunately, we're all stuck here just in this state of gridlock, state of non-action, that nonetheless that we have these many solutions, but we're failing to act on them. Now, I was struck by this recent article's title that read, David, you're going to love this: "Bipartisanship is the secret sauce for effective lawmaking."
Yeah.
despite rising polarization in Congress. Oh, who would have thought? You know, it's that we work together and things will be better. Okay. The secret sauce for a better democracy. It's, well, how do we get there? I guess it's the purpose of this forum is to talk about that. And last, just a cautionary tale on how I started about political polarization here. Neil Fashing and Iftak Lelkish, who's over at UPenn, we actually went to graduate school together at Temple. So they had their newest paper is called Persistent Polarization, the Unexpected Durability of Political Animosity. The findings are incredibly interesting. I think it turns over some of the just usual thinking about polarization today in an election season where we are today. Finds that polarization remains high before, during, and after elections, even in the most contentious time, turning over a thought that in an election period, like during this time on the lead up, there's this high point of animosity, of polarization, and then maybe after that it quiets down, but it's not, that it actually persists, that they're also finding that it may actually worsen post-election. It's really that interesting, but that's a cautionary tale there, that there's this common talking point through the elections is that the election will bring, quote, unity to the country. I think we should unpack that a little bit. Folks, it's a winner-take-all system. So where winner-take-all, there's winners and there's losers. That means that here a group's preferences cannot all be met. And both campaigns have the same unifying message. You know, Trump says, when America is united, America is totally unstoppable. And Kamala Harris is saying, in unity, there is strength. And, you know, that's where's her talking point in an acceptance speech at the DNC. In closing, though, I do want to state about that the spirit of democracy itself being on the ballot is really important to note. And the preservation of democratic norms and what that means I think, capturing the current time, that this could be a really historic election for many reasons, but maybe particularly for that, is the idea that those norms are on the ballot: cooperation, inclusivity, and rule of law, and opportunity, and so forth, and pluralism. So there is such a great stake for grabs this year, not just in the United States, but for the rest of the world. The world is watching. There's 60 countries plus these green countries up here that are going to the polls this year. That makes up the representation of half of the world. So with that, I really hope that we're paying attention. And for many, I think that democracy itself is on the ballot. So thank you.
Jeffrey's prompted me to say just a few more things quickly. I think because of political polarization, we're not going to get rid of the Electoral College, because whichever party thinks it's going to not benefit by getting rid of it, that's not going to happen, because it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify a change in amendments. We talk about the fourth estate, that is the press. Many newspapers have folded across the country. It was thought that social media was going to be wonderful because there'd be more voices, and that's true to some extent. But because of algorithms, people tend to get the same news again and again and again, and not a variety of news unless they want to do that. In a parliamentary system, you could have proportional representation where you have many voices and the need, therefore, to compromise. The founders at the Constitutional Convention rejected a parliamentary system, because the British system had not been well developed and they thought it was corrupt. Most modern democracies do have parliamentary systems. Very few countries around the world have adopted the American system, which was very early. It's a late 18th century system that doesn't fit with 21st century needs. in many respects. And then, as Jeffrey mentioned, there's this problem even with the Electoral College having winner take all. It would be a lot fairer if a candidate won 2/3 of the popular vote in a state if they got 2/3 of the electoral votes, but they don't. So if you win by 10 votes, or technically even 1 vote, you get all the electoral votes. And this is going to cause horrible fighting, it seems to me, over the Electoral College this time around.
David, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It's time for the fun part. This is
Comments
the
or
real
questions?
talk part where we commiserate about all of the things said here, but we take the lead from you all if you want to ask questions about anything that was said here, and we could try to flesh it out. We're going to solve all of these problems, apparently.
It might even be better to have a dominant party, as we've had throughout most of American history. The Republicans controlled from 1896 to 1932, the Dems from 1932, 33 to 93, and the minority party then, in order to get something, had to compromise with the majority. But now neither side thinks it needs to compromise.
Any questions?
Or comments, or criticisms, or contradictions.
Why was you said earlier term limits in Congress was very difficult. What would it take to enact that? That be enacted in Congress itself? I think it would be a constitution.
I think it would have to be a constitutional amendment. And that's not going to happen. The only time the Constitution has been amended, and when there has been a tremendous upsurge and upswelling and change in times, that's after the Civil War with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, or during the Progressive Era with the income tax, women's suffrage, prohibition, which of course was a disaster, and direct election of senators.
Right, and the way that actually would work is that, remember that the folks who has their jobs on the line would be also creating the new law. So they would be acting in their own, against their own self-interest, to be imposing limits for how long that they would have the job. So and on top of that, I mean, that would be, even if it was just an act that runs through Congress, would be very difficult, if not impossible politically to pull off. David, what do you think of it? Let's talk about the map. Fine. Let's talk about I think this is why folks, what they really want to know about the Electoral College in context to the election, and what's going on now.
And that's a problem, of course, because the candidates are not going to electioneer all over the country. They're only going to do it in the 7 states which have the most electoral votes. And this is why both candidates are spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania, which is probably equally divided, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. So whoever wins is going to win by an edge, and there are going to be all kinds of criticisms that it's rigged, and lawsuits, and attempts to overturn whatever the result might be, which is going to further undermine support, respect for, confidence in the American political system. Every other democracy in the world goes by popular vote, with a few exceptions. In this sense, the United States is really not that democratic.
My question relates to the amount of money that's raised. It's in the billions. And I'm just curious if either of you have opinions on how it's used. I mean, I don't watch a lot of network TV, but I watch football this weekend, so obviously I'm inundated with various, campaign ads. I'm just curious if either of you have opinions on the role of fundraising and how it can be better used and more effective, as opposed to just constantly.
One of the reasons that it became so expensive was television. Before the existence of television and then radio, but especially television, it was not as expensive. But if you want to advertise in a media market like New York or Philadelphia or Los Angeles, it's going to cost you fortune, and that's where a lot of the money goes. There have been attempts since the early 20th century to try to limit campaign contributions, and of course Citizens United wiped that off by the farce that their political action committees are not really donating money to the candidates, and everybody knows that that's not true. So there's this corruption of money, and you find that Congress people and candidates are going to go along with the money bags, and that's why we've tried to keep that kind of money out of politics. We also have ridiculously long election cycles here. They tend to last for 2 years. In the UK, I think the election lasts for about 6 weeks, and they don't spend horrendous amounts of money in the process. Jeffrey?
It's very scary, because if you look at the aggregate amount of expenditures that campaigns have, that we just know what kind of spending that they do, it is presidential elections is in the billions of dollars, and even for elections for the House of Representatives or the Senate are the tens and tens of millions. So it's getting to be a more expensive game, and a lot of that does go to media, consultants, to election day activities on the ground, to supplies. But there's a lot of expenditures that we don't know what it is being used for. Is quite scary. So there's two parts. We don't know, because of Citizens United, there's an undercurrent of money called dark money that can be unlimited just in terms of how much is raised, and corporations can contribute to those funds. And it's my understanding that there's a good amount of money that's being used for legal counsel in case a candidate loses, in which they can use to beat back the results of the election, which is really scary.
This is kind of an archaic response to something. In the good old days, when there were 3 major television networks, none of the news programs could afford to go too far one way or the other. They would lose audience and they would lose sponsors. With the emergence of cable television, then you have extreme points of view on these cable programs. And so people who are for Harris are going to watch MSNBC, and people who are for Trump are going to watch Fox News, and they're not going to hear anything else. And then that's going to be further reinforced by social media and algorithms. Mm-hmm. So the framers of the Constitution thought that a free media would inform people and would not allow people to get away with lies of one kind or another, and it's not the case now. And I don't know what we're going to do about it.
Right. I think that's one of those type of expenditures that we're not sure of, is how much money is put out for misinformation and disinformation campaigns. That's really, really ugly stuff. One of those things too, I mentioned this before, I think your point, David, about the electoral college just having so many mechanisms in it that there could be a lot of games that's played in that. I think that there's going to be a fair amount of legal challenges in terms of who the electors are in certifying the election, because there's a playbook that's there, and that's part of drumming up the money in order to have counsel, beat back the election results. That's really ugly underbelly part of this too.
By the way, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention left it up to the state legislatures to decide how the electoral votes were to be determined and scored. They could have it by congressional district. Iowa does that, and Maine does that. Pennsylvania could do it too, but it doesn't. And in fact, the state legislatures themselves could decide on the electoral results, and some of them did in the very early period.
It's a good point. The institution itself of selecting the president was meant by the framers not to be democratic at all, right?
No,
it has an indirect mechanism. In fact, the framers had the House of Representatives be the democratic body. So it just goes to show, I mean, how Democratic forward were the framers. They actually were.
Well, democracy was a bad word. It was a chaotic mess in Athens, is what they thought. And they came up with the Electoral College at the last minute, just a few days before they adjourned in Philadelphia. They talked about this, and they talked about that, and they talked about the other thing. And what they came up with was a system that would mirror the Great Compromise, so to speak. That is, the state would get the same number of electoral votes as representatives in the House and the 2 senators in the United States Senate, which of course gives to the smaller states a larger say in electing the president, because no matter how tiny their population is, there are some states, for example, like Montana, not to pick on Montana, that has fewer people than I think Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, are about the same. But they get 3 electoral votes. So Montgomery County could get 3 electoral votes or more, and that's not what happens. So part of it is because they really didn't believe in democracy. Another problem was they thought that because of the lack of rapid transportation and communication, there'd be no way that the voters could find out anything about the candidates or know who they were. And so there had to be this elite electoral college to make that determination. By the way, only about 6% of human beings in the United States had the right to vote when the Constitution went into effect. Women didn't, enslaved people didn't, men who owned property didn't. Now this changes, of course, over time and over time and over time. But there have constantly been efforts to suppress voting, to keep certain categories of people from voting so that you could choose the electorate. Jackie, you had something to say.
Question. So, Jethro teaches a course on, media, social media, and, you've been adding in insights. This came to me last year when we had the attack on Hamas on Israel and then the counterattack on Gaza, and suddenly the whole campus was, all upset about what was going on, and I found myself needing to comment, and students were telling me things that they had learned on social media, So I've just been doing informal polling, and I formalized it a little bit in my Gen Ed course this semester. I wanted to know where people are getting their news. So I'm just making this up, 4 categories that they could choose. I asked them what percentage, they're getting 10%, 40%, 80%. Traditional media, including television, okay? The news aggregator, like Apple News or Google News, something like that. And then friends and family, okay? I think you have to think very hard to guess where the overwhelming percentage points went. Social media. And traditional media attracted 0 to real for maybe 10%. And I don't really see this changing. And so I guess I'm asking you, what's the future? I feel like you get smart and you kind of like Elon Musk and say this is the game, so I'm going to play it. And I'm trying my best, folks, to entice students to go to traditional media, and even political science majors are just glued to that social media. And it's so interesting because when the Arab Israeli official said, please, get the rest of your news from social media, that's fine. But, if you really want to be up to date, go to any of the, major news sources. They have an updated ticker that will tell you events. And the big difference is that traditional media will correct itself. They publish an errata page. Social media never does. It just goes on and on. And anything that's said is there, and nobody ever corrects themselves. And so, and now I'm going for one more thing out. So, you know, the halcyon days of media, when was that? 50s, 60s, but what about before? We know there's yellow journalism beforehand. Go look at the founding period. My goodness, you know, some name calling. But then what was your alternative? The Lincoln-Douglas circuit debate. Okay, that was probably a little more high-minded, but normally people were just talking to each other and spreading rumors, right?
True.
So I'm wondering if
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, in the past, in a town, even a county seat town of 10 or 15,000 people, there would be a newspaper run by the Republicans and a newspaper run by the Democrats. And this was true in Philadelphia. There were newspapers that were aligned with one party as opposed to the other. So I don't know whether it's worse or not. Our students are addicted to social media, as we know. I think if you try to deprive them of their phones, they feel as if you've cut their hands off or something, literally, as if it's part of their body. And it's really a concern. I think the candidates are trying to adapt themselves to it, trying to use social media as best they can. Jeffrey?
I agree. Thanks for the question, Jackie. On one hand, we're living in this environment that there's more information available to us than ever before. So it makes for this situation where not only do we have to wade through the actual contents of an issue, we at the same time are engaging in conversation about the content. So I agree that I don't really think that goes away anytime soon. And in the digital media environment, the blending of the media itself, it's so large and diffuse. You can have an outfit like the New York Times that could be described as both a traditional media outlet, a digital media outlet, and then there are parts of it that are related to the social media aspect of it. So it's extremely complicated. I think that it also requires that we have a completely different set of skills, just in terms of media literacy, how we take in information, how we look at the sources, and also too, just I mentioned the misinformation and disinformation that's part of it, about how pervasive that is, and how difficult it is that when it is in one of these outlets that can even be one of the sources that we really find credible, it's really just hard to beat back what we think about an issue once it's already has been reported, and we've been taking it in. So certainly I think that is the challenge that we face today in the 21st century. It's exciting on one hand that we have this new environment, but my gosh, there is this certainly that these challenges ahead, especially when news is now starting to be aggregated and put together, and now not even written up for us, that AI is writing up our content for us. So it makes for quite the scary environment. So we have to really think about what our role is in terms of a consumer and of news, and what our role is in terms of what we can do to have better conversations and output given this digital environment. It's really incredibly daunting.
There's also the age-old problem of cognitive dissonance. If someone firmly believes something, you can give that person all the proof imaginable, tapes of what somebody said, 100 tapes of what somebody said, and they'll deny that it's true. Now, we're all guilty of that to some extent. It's a kind of a human condition. But recently we're finding that some Republican politicians are shown tapes of Trump saying things, and they have to admit it's true. But then he said, well, he didn't really mean it. First of all, they deny that he said it. And then secondly, they said he doesn't really mean it. So I don't know how you get around that kind of thing. I don't know how you disprove what people want to believe. And this is in everyday aspects of life and not just in politics.
I have a question. So it's polarized as it is right now. I didn't got the outs. No.
Yes, it's the most polarized county, isn't it?
I'm just curious if either of you have an opinion on the role of Liz Cheney and other Republicans sort of endorsing like President Harris. And 20 years ago, that would have been a huge deal. I'm wondering, is that really, will that have an impact? Whereas not.
I know you had the Reagan Democrats at one time back in 1980. Jeffrey, do you think it's going to sway people? I don't think it will. If they firmly believe in Donald Trump, they don't care what Liz Cheney says, or the Republican. It's interesting that they did that at Washington's Crossing up there. That was rather symbolic. They didn't bring that out in the news, though. It just said Bucks County. And I noticed the bridge in the background and the barn where they kept the boats. But, Jeffrey, what do you think?
It has no sway.
Probably not.
No, it has no effect whatsoever. Even among a sliver of the population that are the undecided voter, which is hard to estimate empirically, but they say that, let's say, taken among all of the voters, it's even less than 5% of the population. And even with that it's a really great show of bipartisanship and so forth, but that that at the end of the day has quite a nominal impact. But that doesn't mean that it's historic or symbolic in its own right, but just the impact of what it could have overall on an election. But it's to your point, Andy, it's that there are some things and norms and events and what events could have done to an election today just don't hold to what they were in the past.
People often vote for irrational reasons. I've always been a blank, or my family's always voted such and such, and I'm not going to change my mind now. And they don't really vote on the basis of information, policies, how that's going to affect me. Very few people. You know more about that than I do, Jeffrey, I think.
David, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Gosh, so many questions I want to ask you all the time.
Right.
How about this one? Is it time to get rid of this electoral college?
Yes, but it's not going to happen. Strom Thurmond, I think, kind of trashed it back in the early 70s. By the way, the South has always liked the Electoral College. And one of the reasons they wanted it is because with the Three-Fifths Compromise, they got extra credit for enslaved people in the South. And if they based it just on freed people or voters and so forth, they'd get him fewer electoral votes. So it's a kind of a scandal, the Electoral College, but I'm not going to get rid of it. Yes, Jackie?
What about my favorite, adaptation? It's not getting rid of the electoral college, but I think if we fix it, how about, addressing gender?
Yeah, well, exactly. Right. Well, the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so that it becomes difficult to go in and to try to override gerrymandering in various states.
I have this map here. Here's the Electoral College. And the beige here are the toss-up states, and the dark blues are the solidly blue. That it's probably very unlikely that, if not impossible, for a Republican candidate to win in those states, and vice versa with the red. And David, I think that look at the map. I think one of the things that the framers never anticipated is just a distribution of the population to the United States. Is when I was in college during the 2000 election, just remembering what it was of the Electoral College, not only being that close, but how unprecedented it could be for the loser of the electoral
Right.
vote to be different than the popular vote. But it just seems to be that this is a situation that is not only, at least for right now, going to occur more frequently.
Right.
Right.
There have been 5 times in U.S. history when the winner of the popular vote did not win the electoral vote and didn't become president. And most of those times it was because there was polarization, as in 1876 and 1888 and 2000 and 2016. The 1824 was a little different because of Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. But it often leads to anger that the person who won it is illegitimate. Rutherford B. Hayes was called Rutherford B. Hayes and his fraudulency and so forth. Now, people didn't say that W. Bush was illegitimate, particularly, although a lot of people said that about Trump.
Right.
Yes.
So, how many more hurricanes and droughts and climate extreme events is it going to take to adjust this electoral college a little bit?
Right.
Back.
I was reading in the New York Times that some people are leaving Florida, particularly people who are younger can afford to get out because they think they're going to be constant storms there. It's no longer the promised land. People are leaving California too for other reasons.
Sure. I think that there's interesting demographic changes across the United States that's going to adjust the electoral college tally. I think there are some states that are incredibly big and diverse and dynamic that we really have to keep an eye on.
Texas is a good
Texas is being a really good example of that, of a state that is certainly heavily Republican, but is incredibly populous and dynamic in its own right, that it's going to maybe be a swing state.
It could be
soon, and maybe in 2028.
It has 40 electoral votes, and if you just win by 100, you get all of them. But if we're proportional, you might end up getting 22 of them and 18 of them or something like that. And Texas might tip, and then all 40 are going to go, and the rest of them won't get anything.
Is there another state, I guess you're saying Texas?
Yes.
That might, is there another one even that is swinging that way?
Georgia.
North Carolina. It's the new South. Virginia already has.
I think that with this question, it would only be fair, though, David, to think about how groups themselves are political parties are subject to this idea of realignment, meaning that groups can switch in mass, can switch parties on average.
That happened in the 1960s with the South being solidly Democratic and they flip and become Republican. So that's happened. And African Americans used to vote solidly for the Republican Party. And then they became Democrats.
Interesting.
So,
this election, though, it's especially among minority men, African American, Latino men, increase in the Republican Party.
well, I think I don't know, Latino men, it's machismo. They're not going to have some woman pushing them around and telling them what to do. And that may be with African American men too. They don't have women pushing them around.
I wonder if this is like a little mini social science experiment going on because, you've got groups that are historically repressed and sort of being, it always seems that if it comes down to race or gender, race will trump in terms of, getting the accommodation. And so here's a chance to see this race
Right.
as a whole.
And there's some are saying you have to have a man to be tough and protect the country. A woman couldn't possibly protect the country and protect us, which is rubbish, of course, but people believe it.
Yeah, there are some interesting demographic shifts that I think we should really pay attention to, particularly about what's called the diploma divide. Yeah, those are the college educated and not and how, let's say, the realignments is particularly in this area of this large demographic of college educated women in the suburbs, this combination of the 5 surrounding counties that are really caring and moved in droves to the Democratic Party is really the supporting base of the Democratic Party in this region. So just really just interesting, some interesting demographic shifts since
And this has changed
2016.
because in the North anyway, if you were college educated, you probably were a Republican 70 or 80 or 90 years ago, and that's flipped also. Yes.
How many years do I have in sets?
I wish we did, right?
Oh, we don't know. They're so
Wisconsin,
close.
Michigan, Pennsylvania, they're so close.
I think that some of the polling, that there are some things that could come out of that could be very interesting, just in terms of prediction. But they're so close that can't call, and that means that the presidential election as a whole is a toss up.
But the polls are often wrong, so we don't know.
They could be wrong. They certainly were in 2016. I think the science is, it's imperfect, and also, too, it's just how the questioning of response rates and accuracy of responses over time. They seem to be gotten better in 2018, 2020. Did some prediction, but as of right now, it looks to be a toss up.
Dead heat.
The election itself is really up for a toss up. It's if it's dead heat and the margin of error is in 4%. Think about it this way: 4% could be a landslide victory for either candidate. So what do we know? So it's so close. But that could show, though, that the polls could be telling, though. Because certainly President Biden and his team were certainly looking at this, because at a really low point, the lead up to the summer and through the summer, that it just the polls were suggesting, the science was suggesting there wasn't a pathway to victory for President Biden if he remained. And so with that, seems to be a toss-up election right now. I go to say it's not going too far off on the limb, but if I think David would agree, if President Biden would have stayed in the race, he would have not made it, and the polls would have indicated that for sure.
Brian, you have a question or comment?
I find it very interesting, the light blue and the light red.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the home state of both vice presidents look, based on this chart, they could swing either way. They're not solidly blue or solidly red. Of the light blue or light red, which one would surprise you if it flipped the other way?
Oh, I love that. Of the ones that would be either leaning slightly
Ohio's
Democrat
gonna
or
flip.
Republican, which ones could?
You mean Ohio being a light red one instead of a deep red one, which is, you're talking about Ohio among them, which is light red, and that's where Vance is from.
Yeah, I had to think about
Yeah,
Walton is from.
right. Light blue, yeah.
There's obviously other light blue and light red states. If Texas went blue, would that be the most shocking thing?
If Texas ever turns blue, then the Republicans have had it for as long as you can imagine.
But I think that there are pathways. Brian, you asked such a really interesting question, because there have been times like this of these states, swinging a different way, ones that weren't completely ones that were going to swing. I think Texas is one of those states. Does it go blue? Not this election. But there are always the signs, though. It's important to pay attention to the other races that are going on in those states.
Yeah.
For example, that Senator Ted Cruz is up with a real challenge there.
Yes, yes.
And does he end up losing his seat?
He'll go to Cancun. That's what he'll do
Oh, that,
during the election. I grew up in Ohio, and the whole southern 2/3 of the state, particularly the southern half, was populated by people from the upper South. And that's true of southern Indiana and Illinois, people from Kentucky and Virginia or West Virginia. And it was all Democratic, interestingly enough, until the 1960s. In fact, my hometown voted against Lincoln twice in 1860 and 1862. The Republican stronghold was Cleveland and up around the lakes, and then that flipped. But I think you're talking about Rust Belt, too, in the upper part of Ohio, which recently has been tremendously Democratic. So I don't think there's much hope for that. My hometown is just plastered with Trump signs, just every place. And I don't dare talk to some of my cousins out there.
But it doesn't appear the vice presidential picks solidified by the party that particular state.
Well, Ohio is going to go Republican anyway. Maybe Minnesota's different, though. Maybe that's going to be helpful.
Well, she had down to 3.
Mm-hmm. Right.
and that's purposeful.
That's purposeful, yeah.
For sure.
What about
It's-
Shapiro,
it's
though? She did not choose
Yes.
Shapiro.
picking in the swing states for
Right.
sure. Is part of that electoral game
Right.
that's played. Hmm.
My question was, it seems to me that messaging, since Harris has come in, has been tighter for the Democrats than has been for the Republicans, and especially on the question of early voting. And I just wonder if that's the factor that's really going to fight the Republicans. Because I heard vote, you should do it, and vote if you got it,
I know.
expect it. And so that holds some votes back for the
I'm concerned about it for another reason, because there could be a late October surprise, and people would say, my God, I've already voted. I wish I hadn't voted for that person, given what's been revealed. So I think that's dangerous in some ways.
so you're just talking about early voting.
Right, in general, not for one party as opposed to the other.
I think it matters for sure. Early voting as an apparatus, as part of the Democratic Party's playbook to make the electoral system accessible by any means is just a push among the platform of the party, and certainly it worked to their advantage. And but I agree with that. It has been a consistent talking point to make sure that to not just get out and vote if you can find your way that would work for you to vote, if whether that's early voting or voting by mail, if you have to get absentee. That certainly is one of the points that's
Or
in
pile up
mind.
as many votes as you can by
Yeah.
election day so that there's not a lot of question that night.
I am concerned. I have to be forthright though about the playbook of the games that may be played just in terms of after the votes are counted. That's my concern about the rule bending there, about the money that I understand is going to council to certify, to beat back the certification of election of a certain candidate loses, is very scary. It's very, very scary to me. That just means that there's just a preparation, resources, and a motive that's there, that is a setup for having to overturn the presidential election results, and not certifying. That is a real threat, and I really hope that we don't have a situation like January 6th all over again, but the conditions all point
Well,
to
that was just a love fest, remember, Johnny?
Someone asks Trump, will you accept the results? And he says,
Yes, and there, if forthright says no, and finally, the J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate, that has said explicitly about 2020 that
he didn't
that he didn't lose, and there's just a real question about that, and that in and of itself is very scary. I want to give the silver lining, though, is that seems to be very minimal little impropriety in terms of the voting mechanism itself, meaning that the votes are counted, and the fraud that is said to be there in the system is really not there, right? It's county to county to county, but where the games that are being played is after that. And what goes on to the timeline between November and January has me severely concerned about that, meaning that it might be unlikely that we have the election is called on election day.
Probably unlikely.
And what comes for the months after, just in terms of transition for power, for me is something that
There's no evidence that illegal immigrants are voting. There's no evidence that dead people are voting. There's no evidence that people are voting 50 or 100 times. But you can't convince someone who believes that.
correct, right?
And you would say, what's your proof? How do you know that? Oh, I just know.
It has been a simple and parsimonious and effective talking point that has been, that it's
the answer-
effective. But
Did Trump lose?
hasn't been
Well, but
true.
there were irregularities in the election. That's what they come back and say.
Right.
Okay, well, I think we need to let these good people go, and
Yes.
I need to teach a class.
Yeah, David, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for attending, and for folks online, thank you for tuning in. Take care.